"I'll love you forever," she promised at the altar. But forever ended when she found his other 3 wives buried behind the stagecoach wheels stopped turning just as the sun began to hide behind the mountains. Margaret pressed her gloved hand against the dusty window and looked out at Dust Creek for the first time. The town sat in the valley like a handful of wooden boxes someone had dropped and forgotten to pick up. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, thin and gray against the orange sky. Everything looked smaller than she had imagined during the long nights when she read Thomas's letters by candlelight. She stepped down from a coach, her dark blue traveling dress heavy with dust from the 3-day journey. The driver handed her 2 worn leather cases and tipped his hat. "Good luck to you, miss," he said, but his eyes looked sad when he said it. She wondered why. "Thank you," Margaret said, though her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. The stagecoach rolled away, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the dirt street. A few people watched from doorways and windows, but nobody came forward to greet her. She had expected Thomas to be waiting, but the street was empty except for a sleeping dog and a tumbleweed that rolled past her feet like it was running away from something. The silence felt heavy, like the air before a storm. Margaret had grown up in Philadelphia, where there was always noise, carriages on cobblestones, people calling to each other, church bells ringing the hours. Here, the quiet pressed against her ears until she could hear her own heartbeat. A door opened across the street, and a tall man in black clothes walked toward her. She recognized him from the small photograph he had sent, Thomas Whitmore, the man she had come here to marry. He was older than she expected, maybe 40, with gray already showing in his dark hair. His face was kind enough, but his eyes looked tired, like he had seen too much of something he didn't want to remember. "Miss Margaret," he said, taking off his hat. His voice was deep and gentle. "Welcome to Dust Creek. I hope the journey wasn't too hard on you." "It was fine," she lied, smoothing down her skirt. 3 days of dust and bad food, and sleeping sitting up had left her feeling like a wilted flower. "I'm happy to be here at last." Thomas picked up her cases like they weighed nothing. "We'll have the ceremony tomorrow morning, if that suits you. The town is eager to meet their new preacher's wife." Margaret nodded, though something cold touched her spine when he said it. She had agreed to marry him through letters, a practical arrangement that would give her a home and him a wife to help with his church work. She was 26 and had no family left, no prospects in Philadelphia except working in the textile mill until her fingers bled. Thomas had seemed like God's answer to her prayers, a good man doing God's work in a place that needed hope. But standing here now, looking into his tired eyes, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. "Come," Thomas said. "Let me show you to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. She'll take good care of you tonight." They walked down the main street, their footsteps the only sound except for the wind whistling through the gaps between buildings. Margaret tried to smile at the people who watched from windows, but most of them looked away quickly, like they had been caught doing something they shouldn't. Mrs. Henderson turned out to be a small, round woman with kind eyes and flour on her apron. She welcomed Margaret with a warm hug and led her to a tiny room on the second floor. "You must be so tired, dear," she said, setting down fresh water for washing. "And nervous about tomorrow, I expect." "A little," Margaret admitted. She had been too tired to feel nervous during the journey, but now that she was here, her stomach felt like it was full of butterflies trying to escape. Mrs. Henderson sat on the edge of the narrow bed and took Margaret's hands in her own. "Thomas is a good man," she said, but her voice sounded like she was trying to convince herself as much as Margaret. "He's had some difficulties in the past. Lost his first wife to fever a few years back. It changed him some, made him quiet." Margaret felt the cold touch her spine again. "He didn't mention being married before." "Oh." Mrs. Henderson's face went pale. "Well, I'm sure he would have told you eventually. Men don't like to talk about such painful things. His poor Sarah, she was such a sweet girl. Only 19 when she passed." That night, Margaret lay in the narrow bed and listened to the wind rattle the windows. She thought about Thomas's tired eyes and the way the townspeople looked away when they saw her. She thought about Mrs. Henderson's pale face when she realized Thomas hadn't mentioned his first wife. Most of all, she thought about the dogs sleeping in the street and the tumbleweed rolling away like it knew something she didn't. The wedding dress Mrs. Henderson had lent her hung from a hook on the wall. In the moonlight coming through the window, it looked more like a burial shroud than a bridal gown. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself thinking about the long journey back to Philadelphia and wondering if she had enough money left for a stagecoach ticket. But she was tired of running, tired of being afraid. She had come here to build a new life, and she would see it through. How bad could it be? Thomas was a preacher, after all, a man of God, and if he had kept one small secret about his past, well, didn't everyone have things they prefer not to talk about? The wind died down as the night grew deeper, and Margaret finally fell asleep. She dreamed of walking down a church aisle toward a man whose face she couldn't quite see. The church was full of people, but when she tried to look at them, their faces melted away like candle wax. She woke just as the dream Thomas turned to face her, his eyes black as the bottom of a well. Morning came too soon and not soon enough. Margaret washed her face with cold water and put on the borrowed dress. It fit well enough, though it smelled faintly of roses and something else she couldn't name, something that reminded her of earth after rain. Mrs. Henderson brought her coffee and toast, but Margaret could only manage a few sips. Her stomach felt like it was tied in knots. "It's normal to be nervous," the older woman said, patting her shoulder. "Every bride feels this way." But Margaret wondered if every bride felt like she was walking toward her own grave. The church bell began to ring, calling the town to witness her wedding. Margaret took one last look in the small mirror, smoothed down her hair, and walked downstairs to meet whatever waited for her in Dust Creek. She had promised herself a new life, and she would keep that promise, no matter what it cost her. As she stepped outside into the bright morning sun, she noticed something she had missed the night before. Behind the church, 3 small wooden crosses stood in a row under an apple tree. The graves looked well tended, with fresh wildflowers placed at each headstone. Margaret found herself staring at them until Mrs. Henderson gently took her arm. "Come along, dear," the woman said softly. "Thomas is waiting, and it's bad luck to keep a groom waiting on his wedding day." But as they walked toward the church, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that the luck had already turned bad, and there was nothing she could do now but see where it would lead her. The wedding had been simple. Too simple, maybe. Thomas spoke the words in a voice that sounded like he was reading from someone else's prayer book. Margaret said, "I do," to the floorboards because she couldn't meet his eyes. The townspeople clapped politely, but the sound died too quickly in the small church. Now, 3 weeks later, she stood in the kitchen of Thomas's house. Her house now, she kept reminding herself, stirring a pot of stew and trying to understand the life she had chosen. The house sat apart from the town, close enough to walk to church, but far enough that the silence felt complete. Thomas liked the quiet, he said. It helped him think about his sermons. Margaret had tried to make the place feel like home. She cleaned the windows until they sparkled, swept the dust from every corner, and planted herbs in the small garden behind the house. But something about the place fought against her efforts. The room stayed cold, even when the fire burned bright. The floors creaked in places where no one was walking. And the apple tree outside the kitchen window cast shadows that moved wrong, even when there was no wind. The tree bothered her most of all. It was old and gnarled, with branches that reached toward the house like fingers trying to grab hold of something. The strange thing was, it never had any apples, not even blossoms in spring. Thomas said it was diseased, but Margaret had grown up around fruit trees, and she knew the difference between sick and cursed. Beneath the tree, 3 wooden crosses marked 3 graves. Travelers, Thomas had explained when she first asked about them. Poor souls who died of fever on their way through town. The ground here was soft, so we buried them where they fell. Christian thing to do. But Margaret noticed that the graves were all the same size, and they all faced the same direction. And each one had been decorated with the same kind of wildflowers, the kind that only grew in one place in Dust Creek, behind Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. The kind Mrs. Henderson tended every morning with her own hands. Margaret stirred the stew and tried to push the thoughts away. She was being foolish, letting her imagination run wild like a child afraid of shadows. Thomas was a good man, a preacher. He read his Bible every morning and said grace over every meal. He treated her with kindness, never raised his voice, never made demands of her that she couldn't meet. But kindness wasn't the same as warmth, and politeness wasn't the same as love. The front door opened, and Thomas's footsteps echoed through the house. "Smells good," he called, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. He did the same things every day at the same times, like he was following a script written by someone else. "Beef stew," Margaret said, ladling it into 2 bowls. "And fresh bread." They sat at the small table in the kitchen, eating in the comfortable silence that had become their habit. Thomas chewed slowly, thoughtfully, like he was solving some problem in his head. Margaret watched his face, looking for something she couldn't name, some sign that he was truly there with her, not just going through the motions of being a husband. "I went to see Mrs. Garrett today," Margaret said, trying to start conversation. "Her baby has been sick with a cough. I thought I might bring her some soup tomorrow." Thomas looked up from his bowl. "That's thoughtful of you." Though Mrs. Garrett, well, she's particular about who she lets into her house. Might be better to send the soup with her husband. She seemed friendly enough at the general store. Asked how I was settling in. Did she? Thomas set down his spoon and looked at Margaret with those tired eyes. "What did you tell her?" "Just that I was happy. That you've been good to me." Thomas nodded and went back to his stew. But Margaret caught something in his expression. Relief, maybe, or worry. She couldn't tell which. After dinner, Thomas retreated to his study to work on Sunday's sermon. Margaret cleaned the dishes and tidied the kitchen, then stepped outside to check on her herb garden. The evening air was cool and sweet, carrying the smell of sage and distant rain. She knelt by the small patch of earth where she had planted basil and thyme, pulling weeds and checking for new growth. The work felt good, real in a way that nothing else in Dust Creek seemed to be. Her hands in the soil, the green smell of growing things, the simple task of caring for something that would care for her in return. A sound made her look up. Voices coming from the direction of town. She could see 2 women walking along the main street, their heads bent together in conversation. Even from a distance, Margaret could tell they were talking about something serious, something secret. She stood and brushed the dirt from her hands, meaning to go inside. But the wind shifted, carrying fragments of words across the empty space between the house and town. Should have warned her. What happened to the others? That tree. Margaret's blood went cold. She strained to hear more, but the women had moved too far away, their voices lost in the evening air. She stood frozen in her garden, her heart beating fast enough to hurt. What others? She looked over at the apple tree and the 3 graves beneath it. The wooden crosses stood perfectly straight, like soldiers at attention. In the fading light, she could just make out the dates carved into the wood. All recent, all within the last 5 years. All women's names. Margaret's hands began to shake. She told herself she was seeing things, letting her imagination turn innocent dates into something sinister. But she couldn't unsee what she had seen. Sarah Whitmore, 1881. Rebecca Walsh, 1882. Mary Chun, 1884. Thomas had told her his first wife died of fever, but he hadn't mentioned the others. She heard the front door open behind her. "Margaret." Thomas's voice carried easily across the yard. "What are you doing out there?" "Just checking the herbs," she called back, surprised that her voice sounded normal. "I'll be in soon. Don't stay out too long. The night air isn't good for a woman." Margaret nodded and waved, but she didn't move. Not yet. She needed a moment to think, to figure out what she had discovered and what it meant. 3 graves. 3 women. All recent. All under the apple tree that never bloomed. The tree that cast shadows wrong. The tree that stood guard over secrets Thomas didn't want to tell. When she finally went inside, Thomas was reading his Bible by lamplight. He looked up and smiled, a gentle, tired smile that might have been real or might have been practice. "Good book tonight." "Always," he said. "The Lord's word never fails to bring comfort." Margaret nodded and said good night, kissing his forehead like a proper wife should. But as she climbed the stairs to their bedroom, she found herself thinking about the women's voices on the wind, about warnings that came too late, about the apple tree that knew more secrets than it could ever tell. She lay in bed that night, listening to Thomas's steady breathing beside her, and wondered what had really happened to Sarah and Rebecca and Mary, and whether she would end up buried beneath that cursed tree, another secret for the wind to whisper about on quiet evenings in Dust Creek. Outside, the apple tree's branches scratched against the window like fingers trying to get in. The storm came without warning on a Tuesday morning in late October. Margaret woke to thunder rolling across the desert like God's own wagon wheels, and lightning that turned the bedroom white as bone. Thomas was already gone. He always left early on Tuesdays to visit the sick and elderly in town. She was alone in the house when the rain began to fall. At first, she was grateful for it. The desert had been dry for months, and her herb garden was struggling despite her careful tending. She stood at the kitchen window, watching the water pour down like a blessing, pooling in the hard-packed earth and running in little rivers toward the apple tree. But as the morning wore on, the blessing began to feel more like punishment. The rain fell harder and harder, turning the yard into a muddy lake. Wind howled around the house, rattling windows and doors. Margaret lit every lamp she could find, but the darkness seemed to press against the glass, hungry to get inside. By noon, the storm had been raging for 4 hours. Margaret paced from room to room, worried about Thomas riding home in such weather. She made coffee she didn't want and bread she wouldn't eat, keeping her hands busy while her mind wandered to dark places. The sound of rain on the roof was like drum beats, steady and relentless. Then, just after 2 o'clock, the storm stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it hurt her ears. Margaret opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, breathing air that smelled like earth and lightning and something else. Something that made her stomach turn. The yard looked like a battlefield. Water stood everywhere in brown puddles. Her herb garden was destroyed, the small plants beaten down or washed away completely. But it was the apple tree that made her heart stop. The storm had torn away part of the ground beneath it. Where the earth had been smooth and level before, now there were holes and gullies carved by rushing water. And in those holes, things glittered in the watery sunlight. Things that shouldn't be there. Margaret walked across the muddy yard on unsteady legs. With each step, the smell grew stronger. The sweet, sick smell of things that had been buried too long in wet ground. She reached the base of the apple tree and looked down into the largest hole the water had carved. A piece of white fabric fluttered in the mud like a flag of surrender. She knelt without thinking, her dress soaking up the muddy water, and pulled the fabric free. It was silk, fine and delicate, with tiny pearl buttons still attached. Part of a wedding dress. The kind of dress a woman would wear on the most important day of her life. Margaret's hands began to shake. She looked into another hole and saw more white fabric, this piece stained brown with old blood. In a third hole, something gold caught the light. She reached for it and pulled up a locket on a thin chain, the kind young women wore with pictures of their sweethearts inside. Her fingers fumbled with the tiny clasp. The locket opened with a soft click, revealing a small photograph of a woman with dark hair and laughing eyes. Written on the back in delicate script were the words, "To my beloved Thomas, forever yours, Rebecca." Rebecca, the name from his second grave. Margaret dropped the locket like it had burned her. But she couldn't stop looking into the holes, couldn't stop seeing what the storm had revealed. More pieces of clothing. A shoe with a broken heel. A ring that might have been a wedding band. Bones that were too white, too clean, picked over by years of desert creatures. She began to dig. She dug with her bare hands, clawing at the muddy earth around the apple tree's roots. She found pieces of 3 different wedding dresses. 3 lockets with 3 different faces. 3 wedding rings, each one sized for a different finger. 3 women who had stood where she was standing, who had promised to love Thomas forever, who had trusted him with their lives. 3 women who had learned too late that forever was a promise he could never keep. Margaret sat back on her heels, covered in mud and worse things. Her mind felt clear for the first time since arriving in Dust Creek. Everything made sense now. Thomas's tired eyes, the way townspeople looked away. Mrs. Henderson's nervousness. The graves that all faced the same direction, all decorated with the same flowers. Travelers who died of fever, she whispered to the apple tree. God help me, I believed him. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't hold her. The truth was too heavy, too terrible to carry. She had married a monster. She was living with a man who killed his wives and buried them in his backyard like they were nothing more than dead animals. How long did she have? How long before he decided she knew too much? Before her wedding dress joined the others in the mud beneath the apple tree? The sound of hoofbeats made her look up. Thomas was riding down the main street, his black coat flapping behind him like wings. Even from a distance, she could tell something was wrong with the way he sat his horse. He looked angry, dangerous. Margaret tried to gather up the evidence, to hide what she had found. But there was too much of it, and her hand was shaking too badly to work properly. The lockets slipped through her fingers. The pieces of dress fabric clung to her muddy hands like they were trying to tell her their stories. Thomas reached the house and dismounted. He took one look at the torn-up yard, at Margaret kneeling in the mud beside his apple tree, and his face went very still. "What are you doing, Margaret?" His voice was different, colder. The gentle preacher's tone was gone, replaced by something that made her blood freeze in her veins. "I was checking on my garden," she said, trying to sound normal. "The storm, I can see what the storm did." Thomas walked slowly toward her, his boots squelching in the mud. "The question is what you're doing about it." Margaret scrambled to her feet, clutching one of the lockets behind her back. "Nothing. I was just digging around my apple tree." Thomas stopped 3 feet away from her. Up close, she could see that his eyes were completely different. Not tired anymore. Not gentle. They looked like the eyes of something that hunted in the dark. "Find anything interesting?" Margaret shook her head, but she knew it was too late. He could see the guilt written all over her face. Could see the fear that made her whole body tremble like a leaf in the wind. Thomas reached out and took her muddy hand in his. His grip was strong enough to break bones. "Show me what you found, Margaret." "I didn't find anything. I was just—" "Show me." His voice got quieter, which somehow made it more terrifying. "Don't make me ask again." Margaret opened her hand. The locket lay there like a small golden egg, tarnished but still beautiful. Thomas looked at it for a long moment, then looked back at her face. "Rebecca's," he said, and his voice sounded almost fond. "She was such a pretty girl. Reminded me of you, actually. Same dark hair, same trusting eyes. Thomas, the same foolish curiosity." His grip tightened on her hand until she gasped. "Poor Rebecca. She found my garden too, you know. Asked too many questions. Wouldn't let sleeping dogs lie." Margaret tried to pull away, but he was too strong. "You killed them." "I married them," Thomas corrected. "Loved them. Provided for them. Gave them everything a woman could want. But they couldn't be satisfied with that, could they? Always digging. Always asking questions. Always trying to find secrets that were better left alone. 3 women, Thomas. 3 innocent women. 3 wives who broke their vows." His free hand reached out and touched her cheek with horrible tenderness. "For better or for worse, Margaret. In sickness and in health. Till death do us part." Those are sacred words. Margaret finally understood. Thomas didn't see himself as a murderer. In his twisted mind, he was just a husband who took his marriage vows very seriously. When his wives became inconvenient, he simply held them to their promise to stay with him forever. "You won't get away with it this time," she whispered. "People will ask questions. They'll look for me." Thomas smiled, and it was the most frightening thing she had ever seen. "People have been asking questions for years, Margaret, but I'm a respected man in this town. A preacher. And you." He gestured to her muddy dress, her wild hair, the evidence scattered around the apple tree. "You're just another unfortunate woman who couldn't handle the isolation, who went mad from loneliness and wandered into the desert one night." The truth hit her like a physical blow. He had done this before. The whole routine. The explanation for why his wives disappeared. The town probably half expected it by now. "They'll never find your body," Thomas continued in that gentle, horrible voice. "The desert is very good at keeping secrets. Almost as good as I am." Margaret looked into his eyes and saw her death reflected there, calm and certain as tomorrow's sunrise. But she also saw something else, something that gave her the first spark of hope she had felt since the storm began. Thomas was standing with his back to the house, and just beyond his shoulder, she could see Mrs. Henderson walking up the path from town, a basket on her arm and worry written all over her face. The old woman had come to check on her after the storm, and she was about to walk into something that would either save Margaret's life or end them both. Margaret looked back at Thomas and made her choice. She opened her mouth and screamed as loud as she could, the sound cutting through the desert air like a knife through silk. Margaret's scream cut through the desert air like a church bell calling the faithful to witness. Thomas spun around, his grip loosening just enough for her to tear free. Mrs. Henderson stood frozen at the edge of the yard, her basket of food scattered in the mud, her eyes wide with understanding. "Run!" Margaret shouted to the older woman. "Get help! Get everyone!" But Mrs. Henderson didn't run. She stood there like a woman who had been waiting for this moment for years, her small frame suddenly filled with terrible purpose. "Thomas Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying across the muddy yard with surprising strength. "I should have spoken up long ago." Thomas turned his dead eyes on Mrs. Henderson. "This doesn't concern you, Martha. Go home." "It concerns me plenty." Mrs. Henderson took a step forward, her feet squelching in the mud. "Sarah was like a daughter to me. Rebecca stayed in my boarding house before she married you. Mary helped me tend my flowers every morning." Her voice broke on the last name. "3 good women, Thomas. 3 bright lights you snuffed out like candles. They were my wives," Thomas said, his voice still unnaturally calm. "What happens between a man and his wife is God's business. Murder is everyone's business." Mrs. Henderson reached into her coat and pulled out something that made Margaret's heart leap with hope. A small pistol, old but well-maintained. The kind frontier women carried to protect themselves when their men were away. Thomas laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You think that toy will stop me, Martha? I've been planning for this day. I know every hiding place in this desert, every cave where a man can wait out trouble. By the time anyone finds me, I'll be long gone." "Maybe," Mrs. Henderson said, keeping the gun trained on his chest. "But you won't hurt another woman. Not while I draw breath." Margaret used their standoff to back toward the house. Her mind raced through possibilities. She could run for town, raise the alarm. But Thomas was right about knowing the desert. If he got away, he would disappear like smoke, only to surface somewhere else with a new name and new victims. No, this had to end here, today under the apple tree where it all began. "Mrs. Henderson," Margaret called softly. "Keep him talking. I need to get something." The older woman nodded slightly, never taking her eyes off Thomas. "How long have you been doing this, Thomas? How many towns have you run from? How many graves have you left behind?" "Not nearly as many as I should have." Thomas's mask of civility was completely gone now, replaced by something that belonged in nightmares. "Women are weak creatures, Martha. They need strong guidance. When they stray from the path of righteousness, it's a husband's duty to correct them." Margaret slipped through the back door of the house and into Thomas's study. She knew what she was looking for. She had seen it every Sunday when he prepared his sermons. The large family Bible that sat on his desk, bound in black leather and heavy as a stone. But when she opened it, her blood went cold. The pages had been cut out, leaving a hollow space inside. And in that space lay items that told the real story of Thomas Whitmore. 3 marriage certificates from 3 different towns. 3 death certificates, all claiming fever as the cause. 3 newspaper clippings about mysterious disappearances of young women. And at the bottom, a 4th marriage certificate. Her own, signed just 3 weeks ago in the church where she had promised to love him forever. Margaret's hands shook as she lifted out the hollow Bible. Beneath it lay something else. A journal written in Thomas's careful handwriting. She opened it to a random page and read words that made her stomach turn. "Sarah continues to ask questions about my previous congregation. I fear she has been speaking to the sheriff. The Lord tests me with difficult wives, but he also provides solutions. The apple tree's roots grow deep. Soon Sarah will rest beside Mary, and I will be free to seek a more obedient companion. Page after page of the same horrible calculations. Thomas had been killing wives for over 10 years, moving from town to town like a disease. Margaret counted at least 8 names in his careful records. 8 women whose only crime had been trusting the wrong man. She slammed the journal shut and grabbed the hollow Bible, running back outside where Mrs. Henderson still held Thomas at gunpoint. But something had changed in the few minutes she was gone. Thomas was smiling now, his hands relaxed at his sides. "You know, Martha," he was saying in that gentle preacher voice, "I've always admired your devotion to this community. It would be a shame if something happened to you too." Mrs. Henderson's hands trembled slightly. "Stay back, Thomas." "Or what? You'll shoot me?" "A God-fearing woman like you." Thomas took a step forward. "We both know you don't have it in you to kill. Not even a monster like me." Margaret saw the doubt creeping into Mrs. Henderson's eyes. The older woman was brave, but Thomas was right about one thing. She wasn't a killer. But Margaret had learned something about herself in these past few minutes. When faced with absolute evil, sometimes good people had to do terrible things. "You're wrong about one thing, Thomas," Margaret called out, stepping back into view. "Mrs. Henderson doesn't have to kill you." "Because I will." Thomas turned to look at her, his eyes narrowing when he saw what she carried. "My Bible? What are you?" "It's not a Bible." Margaret opened the hollowed-out book, spilling its contents onto the muddy ground. The marriage certificates scattered like leaves in the wind. The death certificates landed in puddles, their lives dissolving in the rainwater. The journal fell open, its pages displaying Thomas's careful records of murder. "Meet the real Thomas Whitmore," Margaret said, her voice carrying across the yard. "A man who has killed at least 8 wives in at least 4 different towns. A man who keeps souvenirs of his murders hidden in a fake Bible." Thomas's face went white, not with fear, but with rage. His whole body tensed like a spring about to snap. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising for the first time. "They deserved it. All of them." Disobedient, questioning, ungrateful. The gunshot cut off his words. Mrs. Henderson stood with the smoking pistol in her hands, her face pale but determined. Thomas looked down at the red stains spreading across his white shirt, his expression more surprised than pained. "For Sarah," Mrs. Henderson said quietly. "For Rebecca. For Mary. For all the others." Thomas took one step toward her, then another, but his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. He fell to his knees in the mud beneath the apple tree, his hands pressed to his chest as if he could hold his life inside. "You can't. I'm a man of God," he whispered. "God doesn't claim killers, Mrs. Henderson replied. "And neither do I." Thomas fell forward, his face in the mud where he had buried his victims. His last breath rattled out of him like wind through dead leaves. The silence that followed felt different from the desert quiet Margaret had grown used to. This was the silence of justice done, of secrets finally brought to light. She knelt beside Thomas's body and closed his eyes, not out of respect, but because she couldn't bear to see that evil stare any longer. "We need to tell the sheriff," Mrs. Henderson said, lowering the gun with shaking hands. "Show him the evidence. Make sure the other families know what happened to their daughters." Margaret nodded, gathering up the scattered papers. "And we need to give them proper burials. Sarah and Rebecca and Mary. They deserve better than unmarked graves under a cursed tree." But when she looked up at the apple tree, she stopped breathing. For the first time since she had arrived in Dust Creek, the gnarled branches showed signs of life. Tiny white buds were opening along every branch, thousands of them, covering the tree in blossoms that seemed to glow in the gray afternoon light. "Look," she whispered. Mrs. Henderson followed her gaze and gasped. "I've never seen, in all my years here, that tree has never bloomed." Margaret stood slowly, her eyes fixed on the impossible sight. The apple tree was blooming. Not just a few scattered flowers, but a magnificent display that would have done credit to the finest orchard. The air filled with the sweet scent of apple blossoms, washing away the smell of death and old secrets. "They're free now," Margaret said, tears running down her muddy cheeks. "Sarah and Rebecca and Mary. They can finally rest." She thought about the promise she had made at the altar just 3 weeks ago. "I'll love you forever," she had said, meaning it with all her heart. But forever had ended the moment she learned the truth about the man she married. Some promises were meant to be broken. Some forevers were never meant to last. The apple tree bloomed above them like a blessing, like forgiveness, like hope returning to a place that had forgotten what hope looked like. Margaret reached out and touched one of the soft white petals, and for the first time since arriving in Dust Creek, she knew she was going to be all right. The desert had kept its secrets long enough. Now it was time for the truth to bloom.